Hi, Dr. Zizan. I think we can start now. Thank you.
Can we start it now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished delegates, I would like to start the meeting. Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all and to declare open this special visual session, joint session of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice and subsidiary body on implementation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your participation over the last 3 days and for joining us again today. I would like once again to thank the Executive Secretary and her staff for the preparations made for this meeting and my fellow members of the COP Bureau for their support. To set the stage for our discussion, I would like to offer a few words. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as the representative of the current president of the Conference of the Parties, Egypt, it is an honor for me to welcome you to this joint SBSTTA SBI virtual session on presentation of the updated draft Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and related documents for the meetings. As we have heard over the last 2 days, significant progress is being made towards the development of the new Global Biodiversity Framework in the post-2020 period and related agenda items as we advance towards the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which is expected to adopt a global biodiversity framework for the post-2020 period and other supporting decisions. Today is our chance to hear and learn about all the decisions related to post-2020 that COP15 is expected to adopt. I would like to thank the co-chairs of the working group on post-2020 for their leadership and hard work in bringing together the so many views and the perspectives into a useful, accessible, recently updated zero draft. But I should also take a moment to thank all of you for this updated draft framework. It is the product of a collective, worldwide effort of all the 196 parties to the convention, along with biodiversity-related multilateral agreements, businesses, multilateral development banks, indigenous peoples and local communities, youth, non-governmental organizations, local governments, and women, acting together towards a common goal. As students, you remember when we were students, I am certain many of us were assigned to group projects, and I'm equally certain many of us complained quite loudly such assignments. But perhaps we owe our teachers a debt of gratitude for these tasks. In many ways, they were preparing us all for a much larger and more urgent global group project to come. We learned to work together then, and in many ways, we are still learning now. I'm certain we will come together in the days ahead, either face-to-face, screen-to-screen, or a combination of both, to develop an effective, ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I thank you. Distinguished delegates, we are very pleased to have with us the chair of the SBSTTA, Mr. Isidro Benitez Diaz of Mexico, and the chair of the SBI, Mrs. Charlotta Sorkovest of Sweden. I now hand the chairing of this joint session to you both, Isidro and Charlotta.
Thank you, Dr. Sudan, for opening this joint special session and for your remarks. We are very grateful for the continued support and guidance of the COP presidency and the Bureau as we prepare the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Before we begin with our agenda item today, I would like to remind you that all statements that were submitted to the Secretariat for the Resource Mobilization will be posted on the meeting site. Any questions submitted for the parties under review will be forwarded to a party under review with a request to get in touch bilaterally. The experiences and lessons learned from this trial phase will be discussed at SBI 3 during agenda item 9, including modalities and procedures for future SBI forums. The Secretariat will initiate an online survey shortly after the end of this virtual session to gather views on the experience from this trial forum. Today, the SBSTTA chair and I will take regional statements, some statements from parties, and then major groups. Therefore, parties speaking on behalf of the regions, please submit your statements to statements@cbd.int, stating clearly which party will deliver the statement as soon as possible. And all other statements should also be submitted as soon as possible to the same email address. I would now like to focus on today. I would like to invite the Executive Secretary, Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, to deliver her remarks to this joint special virtual session. Ms. Maruma Mrema, please raise your hands. Ms. Maruma Mrema, you have the floor.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this joint special virtual session of the Subsidiary Body on Scientific, Technical, and Technological Advice and the Subsidiary Body on Implementation. I sincerely thank you all for your participation. My special thanks also go to the government of Egypt as our presidents of the COP14 for joining us today. Distinguished colleagues, while we have come together to discuss our progress towards a new global pact to protect biodiversity, at the same time, we are living through one of the most extraordinary threats to global health in modern history. While these two crises are closely interlinked, Your participation in this special session demonstrates that you will not let the latter challenges overcome the former. The impacts of COVID-19 pandemic may have disrupted the daily order of the world for a time, but with due diligence and determination, and with the use of the latest virtual technology, we will not let it disrupt the efforts of the international community to protect and conserve biodiversity and to put an end to the destruction of the ecosystems. Today, we will continue our journey towards the development of an ambitious and wide-ranging post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will set out a global plan to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. The recently updated Zero Draft Framework marks the next critical step on the road to COP15 in Kunming. Based on these discussions, at the second session of the working group, as well as additional submissions, the co-chairs of the working group have now provided us with an updated draft which provides context for the next phase of the process in SBI and SBSTTA. We are fortunate to have our co-chairs with us today to brief us on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process and to present the updated Zero Draft. I'm confident that the distinguished participants in this joint virtual special session will not only learn more about the latest developments, but will also provide us with your invaluable insights, which will help us all make progress in the ongoing negotiation process. Today, we are equally fortunate to have amongst us, and I need to recognize his presence, our very good friend, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the new CEO and chairperson of the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF. The GEF is a financial mechanism, and their support is vital for us to meet any agreements during the 5th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. Thank you, Carlos, for joining us on a very important day where we are discussing the future of biodiversity and for being part of this journey we are on. Ladies and gentlemen, the future of the world and its resources and its continued abundance for the future generations depends on our determination to act now and urgently. I look forward to hearing your inputs on this important topic. Welcome again and thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maruma Maruma. I would now like to invite Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, Chief Executive Officer and Chair of a Global Environment Facility, to make a few remarks. Mr. Rodriguez, before I hand you the floor, I would like to congratulate you on behalf of the parties and participants here today on your new appointment. Mr. Rodriguez, please raise your hand. Mr. Rodriguez, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and good morning. It is a pleasure to greet you all in my new role as the CEO of the Global Environmental Facility. I've been glued to my screen for the last 3 days following the very interesting conversations that you had all this weekend. And I want to thank you also, the Executive Secretary Elizabeth, for the invitation to address you all. I also would like to thank the chairs, Carlota and Ezekiel, for inviting me to participate here. And also would like to recognize the great work that Basile and Francis who are leading the development of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in collaboration with all parties and all stakeholders. So I thank you all for your hard work in continuing to help us refine and improve the Global Biodiversity Framework. For the last 2-3 weeks, I've been reading a lot of reports. the Waldron report, the Paulson report, the Gupta report. I've been following very closely the work that the expert panel on resource mobilization from the CBD has been working. As a matter of fact, I was glued to my screen yesterday while they were presenting. But also, and most importantly, two reports that I had dedicated a lot of my time in reading are the Living Planet report and, of course, GBO 5 that was presented this week. So I consider, in the context of all of this information, that the Global Biodiversity Framework must be the most important roadmap for nature at this critical juncture for our global environment. And I've been working with all of you to discuss and develop it, and have also called to increase the level of ambition in this framework. So I think that we all, particularly parties, delegates, have a great opportunity and responsibilities to develop an ambition post-2020 framework to reach consensus and a strong agreement in Kunming next year. Having been part of this negotiation and being a strong believer of the CBD, I recognize the enormity of the task that we have in front of us. But I'm confident that we will achieve it. Well, I know that the role of negotiations to agree and on a raised level of ambition throughout the global biodiversity framework is challenging. But it won't come as a surprise to all of you that I strongly believe that the issue of resource mobilization must be adequately addressed if we are to realize higher level of ambitions, and particularly after reading the GBO 5, I come to the very clear conclusion that one of the things that really where we really were challenged were on effective resource mobilization. In this respect, I think four elements are key within the open and working group conversation on resource mobilization. One is, yes, we need to increase ODA for biodiversity conservation. Yes, we need to increase efficiency and efficacy in how we mobilize domestic resources at the national level. Third, it is key and very important. I remember in 2010 when we were in Nagoya talking about perverse and positive incentives, and we came up with Aichi target number 3, which is one of the most important and one of the targets where we did less advances and improvement. So the third element, which is critical and is part of what the expert panel reported yesterday, is to address the perverse incentives, perverse investments, particularly from the finance sector, and subsidies. That issue is extremely important in the context of resource mobilization. Being able to phase out those policies and those incentives will dramatically decrease the need for new funding, being this ODA or domestic funding. And the fourth element, which I believe is extremely important, is the need to have a robust, reliable, solid, and strong financial reporting mechanism and tracking system. Those four elements are key, and I hope that those elements can be fully represented in the ongoing negotiation. So as CEO of the GEF and serving as the financial mechanism for the convention, I'm committed to do my utmost support to countries in their effort to implement the agreements and actions agreed under the convention. This global biodiversity framework, as well as the Paris Agreement, will be the biggest foundation for the GEF programming strategy and support for the next phases of the GEF. Well, it is too early to say how much about the replenishment for the... Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you please can wrap up, because we are a bit short of time. Thank you very much.
So, well, it is too early. I was saying that it is too early to say how much of the replenishment process we'll be confronting on the 11th phase, 8th phase. Supporting the implementation of this new framework will no doubt be in the core of the business of the CF. So finally, I would like to say that we want to reaffirm the continuing support to the CBD, and I look forward to to support and strengthen our ties with the CBD Secretariat and the parties in supporting the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, for your inspiring remarks. And we look forward to working with you in the coming years. I will now hand over the chair to Mr. Benitez Diaz, the chair of SBSTTA.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. Distinguished delegates, let us now turn to the key item for our consideration, the presentation of the updated draft Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and related documents for the meetings. Further to Decision 1434 and other relevant decisions of the COP, SBSTTA 24 and SBI 3 will address a number of issues of relevance to the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In addition, the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the second meeting in Rome made a number of requests to the subsidiary bodies and also invite the co-chairs of the working group and the executive secretary to prepare a number of documents. At these joint special virtual sessions, the co-chairs of the working group, Mr. Francis Ogwal of Uganda and Mr. Basil Van Ave from Canada, will provide us with an update of the process for developing the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and present the updated zero draft. I would now like to give the floor to the co-chairs to make their presentation. I understand Mr. Ogwal will start the presentation, followed by Mr. Van Ave. So, Mr. Ogwal, please raise your hand and you have the floor. Mr. Ogwal, you have the floor?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You can proceed, please.
Yeah, so I'll make part of the presentation, and then my co-chair will continue to also make part of the presentation. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of our presentation, this is how it is outlined today. We are going to give you background on the planning process, how we are going on with this work, but also highlight briefly, and SBSTTA Chair has already touched on, the roles of the subsidiary bodies and that of the working group, that is the open-ended working group. Then point out some key recommendations that came from the second meeting of the open-ended working group. Hello? Do you see? Can't see the next screen. Is the slide on? Hello? I'm not seeing the slides. Chair, as chair of the session, I'm not seeing the slides from my side.
Can you please display slides for Mr. Ogwal, please? Technicians?
Still, I can't see it. I don't know. Do I present? But I think so, yeah, it could be coming now. Yes, so there we are. Then after we have looked at the key recommendations coming from the second meeting of the working group, we will also present to you what are we going to take into account as we prepare the draft 1.0. Just to tell you that what we are presenting is updated 0 draft. And what will come up for consideration at the third meeting of the working group will be draft 1.0. Then after highlighting those points, then we shall look at the updated 0 draft, where I will present the goals. I will present the slides on the goals. And my co-chair, Basil, will be presenting on the action targets, the implementation support mechanisms, enabling conditions, responsibility, and transparency. Could we go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Okay. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, we have got these bodies that all do very good work for the convention. But their roles are somehow differentiated, yet they contribute towards what we want to achieve. So when it comes to SBSTTA, their role was to actually look at the science aspects related to the post-2020, and therefore looking at issues on numerical values, looking at the baseline, looking at the indicators. And then when it came to the SBI, that is the body that mainly concerns itself with the implementation. And for the negotiations of this post-2020, that takes place exclusively by the meeting of the open-ended working group. So the goals and targets will not be negotiated by SBSTTA. They may take note of the progress we have made in those areas, but the negotiation on those texts will be by the open-ended working group. So maybe we go to the next slide, please. So what came out from the second meeting of the open-ended working group, which took place in Rome? There were some recommendations that the working group came up with, and one was that we needed to prepare an updated draft of the 0 draft that we had prepared. And this is why now you'll hear us saying that we have got an updated 0 draft. And this was posted on 1st of September on the website that you all know now. So we'd like to thank all that have really been with us and provided input towards this. Of course, in preparing that, we did take into account the outcomes of that second meeting. Then SBSTTA, as I said earlier on, their role from that meeting was that they should provide scientific and technical advice. So that is what mainly came from the second meeting of the open-ended working group. And therefore, as I said earlier, they should be looking at the numerical values, the indicators, the baseline that concerns those targets and goals as you'll be seeing them. Then the SBI, as I said earlier, the means of implementation, and I think you've heard the CEO of GEF mentioning one of those, which was presented yesterday or discussed yesterday, that is resource mobilization, but also capacity development. You may have the resources, but again, if the capacity to implement is not there, your resources could as well be there and not utilized. Then enabling conditions, knowledge management, outreach and awareness, responsibility and transparency. You will be hearing how these are captured here. And then after that, the co-chairs will prepare draft 1.0, as I said, in advance of the third meeting of the working group. Next slide. So in preparing the draft 1.0, what are we going to look at? What are we considering? The outcomes of the meetings of the open working group, that is the first one, and the second one, we are doing that. Then also the meeting of the working group on Article 8J, on Substar 24, Substar 23rd, but also the outcomes of SBI 3. Then written submissions, which we received up to 24th February 2020, and then thematic consultations. We have had a number of this on this process. So those are some of the issues that we are, or the outcomes that we are going to be looking at. We'll be looking at them as they become available in drafting one, coming up with the draft 1.0 for the third meeting of the working group. So let's go to the next slide. I'm trying to be a bit slow because I was told to move at that speed. Now, overall, this is just a flow chart to show you how the work in this process are so linked to Substar, SBI, Open the Working Group, then the COP. And DSI, that is digital sequence information, which is very much linked to access and benefit sharing. As per the decisions of COP, this will be considered at the third meeting of the working group and also taken to COP. But as I said again earlier, that the issue of goals and targets, which you're going to see in this updated zero draft, what Substar is going to mainly look at are those three elements, as you see now, their numerical values, including headline indicators. Those are like the key indicators that all parties are expected to really report on. Then availability of baseline information. Where are we, so that we can assess progress, whether we are making any change or not. But as I said earlier, there are a number of other thematic consultations, and we have got co-leads for those. We have one now, which is on, and now some have already been concluded, but there is the one ongoing on sustainable use, then on synergies with the MEAs, and then on access and benefit sharing. We have co-leads, and co-leads will give us the reports, which we then consider, and it will feed into draft 1.0, which I've been talking about. And then SBI, as I said earlier, those you see, those are the implementation support mechanisms there: resource mobilization, capacity building, enabling conditions, transparency and responsibility. So all that, again, will help us to feed or to update the framework and come to draft 1.0. So then, of course, the other COP decisions that will come from SBI that could still be relevant for this process, and that will be taken to the COP. So that is how overall that framework we are going to capture your input into this process. Next slide. So let's delve a little bit into the updated zero draft now, for which, as I said, I will mainly be looking at the goals. Next slide, and then my co-chair will be looking at the other stages. Next slide. Now, as again, for the outcome in Rome, we've done the following. We've combined goals A, B, and C, and now it is all as goal A. Then we have shortened goal D. That is, I'm referring to the goals that was in the zero draft. Then added a goal on means of implementation. We had this that parties or stakeholders wanted to see this standing out on its own. So you'll see that there. Then we have also added each of milestones, and you're going to see where we are proposed to put the milestones, and this actually falls on under each goal. Then the targets, we had very strongly that there was a need to have one on species. So you're going to hear the target also, which concerns issues on species, which we have presented. Then we are going to look at also sections, targets, you'll look at sections E to H. So let's go to the next slide. So that is the milestones, basically to show us whether we are making any progress at all to our 2030. What have we done that could show us that by 2030 we are making any progress that can lead us to the 2050 goals? And again, it can also help us to evaluate if the action targets are actually the right tools to meet the 2050 vision. Next slide. As a 10 towards the end.
Need to wrap up in 3 minutes, Francis. Thank you.
Okay, so when you look at the updated zero draft, that is the goal A, as you see it there. the area connectivity and intensity of and integrity of natural ecosystem is increased by, again, that percentage is still going to be validated by SBSTTA, and the milestones are there. The area connectivity and integrity of natural ecosystems increased by a certain percentage. We are giving 5 for now, and then the number of species that are threatened are reduced. So those are the milestones there. Then B is nature's contribution to people have been valued, maintained, or enhanced through conservation and sustainable use, supporting global development agenda for the benefit of all people. So again, you'll see below that our proposed milestone. Go to the next slide as I wind up for my co-chair to come in. So goal C is on benefits and utilization of genetic resources that are shared fairly and equitably. And again, you see there, we are saying that first, people should have in place really systems established in all countries as a milestone so that you can have benefits in place shared equitably. Then D, and I will end there, is the means of implementation is available to achieve all goals and targets. We have goals of heard that if we don't address that issue properly, then our ambition, the post-2020, will face challenges. So we are saying there that by 2022, as a milestone, resources should have been identified to implement what we need to do up to 2030. And again, that by 2030, we shall again have mobilized resources to implement the next 10 years, that is from 2030 to 2040. I'll end there now and hand over the floor to my co-chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, co-chair. Now, Basil, you have the floor. Please go ahead and raise your hand. Basil, you have the floor now, co-chair. Basil, you have the floor. If not possible now, I will ask Francis to continue, please. Maybe you can relog again, Basil. Meanwhile, I'll ask Francis if he can continue with the presentation, please.
Yes, Coach, I can. The next slide. I'm not seeing the slides on my screen.
Slide 12 is on the screen, fortunately, so you can continue.
I don't see it here for some reasons. It is blank.
Targets 1 to 3 is on the screen.
Yeah, I don't have it on my screen, so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Basil.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry about that, and good day to everyone. I'll just go through the main changes, so you won't see all the targets in the following slide. The one I won't speak about are in the annex of the deck, and you can always refer to them. In target 1, we've reordered the elements, but basically you have the same element you see before, hopefully with some language that is clearer. In target 2, the main change is you won't see what was there before is the 10% under strict protection. We got a clear signal from the Rome report that was not something that was desired at this point. Target 3 is new and refer to the management action for species that are not otherwise covered. Next slide, please. Target 4 is pretty similar in terms of what was there. We've updated language with your suggestion. 5 on IAS, you see there. On 6, we've broken down the possibility of numerical elements for each of the 3 priority substances. So you're going to be able to see that. And then target 7, the main change is the removal of the numerical element. You will remember there was an element to be expressed either as percentage or megatons, and it was very clear element in the reports that there was no support for that at that point. Moving to the next slide. Now we're moving to the section about how people needs are met, and there I think we had some really interesting and good discussion that led to more clarity. Target 8 is firmly focused on species and how the harvest of species is supporting people, especially the most vulnerable. It includes fishery. Target 9 is more how we use ecosystem. So it includes agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry. Next slide. If you look at target 10, basically, we received clearly the message that there was a need for more clarity, and we went back to the IPBES reports and looked at the list of the ecosystem services and tried to cover all of those that were not otherwise covered there. So air quality, hazard protection from the hazard, extreme event, quality and quantity of waters, etc. Target 11 is based on the previous language, perhaps with a little bit of a broader interpretation. It's the benefit of biodiversity for green and blue spaces, a mention of human health and well-being, and then obviously a look at urban dwellers. Target 12 is pretty much the same as the one that was there before. So let's move to the next slide, where now we're moving into tools and solution, and there was many change in the tools and solution, but I focused on those one. Target 15 is a merger and focus on the indirect cause of biodiversity loss. So we tried to clarify the language, eliminate unsustainable consumption pattern, ensuring people make value biodiversity and make a responsible choice. And then target 16 is the same. It's around biosafety. You've seen all those targets in the document that we discussed for Substar, but now we're moving to the following slide. We will get into a section that is relatively new, which is section I to F. Again, here I have selected the few where there is major change. There is more than that. Francis has been talking about the mobilization of resources. And there very clearly, there is a number of elements. Carlos Manuel talked about the reduction and redirecting of resource, the generation of additional financial and non-financial resources, and the need for a national finance plan. Note the second subtitle, capacity development, which we're trying to suggest maybe a better way than capacity building, enabling better decisions, supporting actors and building capacity. Next slide, please. Knowledge generation and management obviously remain there, and definitively greater protection of traditional knowledge will continue to be an important part of that. The promotion of science and education, definitively. And then the other side of that, the technical and scientific cooperation, including support mechanism for cooperation and support for cooperation amongst developing countries and with developed countries. Next slide. If we move to enabling condition, there is a number of those, but and definitively we should be going through each and every one of those, but definitively the participation on indigenous people and local communities is a key factor, in particular when we get to protected and conserved area. Participation of all stakeholders. I'm glad to see a lot of you around this webinar. Gender, intergenerational equity is very important. Synergies and the very important work done there and the partnership. Moving to the next slide. Governance continue to be highlighted as something that is important. Mainstreaming, engagement of the private sector, and political wheels are also very important. And last but not least, consider and recognize the right of nature. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the responsibility and transparency. It's important to understand, well, why we're doing that. It needs to be a comprehensive system for planning, integrative, and complemented by the system of others. There is 3 aspects to that system, and we can move to the next slide. One is planning, and you will see in our document what we hope will be principles. National plans will remain the key tools. They will integrate all targets and action, address all performance indicators, should include financial aspect, and are updated quickly. There will be indicators, and Francis talked about headline indicators. There will be planning documents and will be updated on a continual basis. Next slide is on reporting. And 4 elements to that. There is national reports. There is also the global reports and global stocktake. Reporting schedule will be should be established. And then there is the issue of the global assessment processes and how do we make best use and ensure that there is complementarity and efficiency in those. And getting to my last content slide, the review process. Yesterday and the day before, I'm very, very pleased to see the trial of the open-ended forum and looking forward to the discussion at SBI. We all know about the global analysis, and we will be continuing with the voluntary in-depth review. So, Mr. Chair, I have completed the presentation right to the minute, and I hand you back the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both co-chairs for this presentation and the explanations on changes, updating on goals and targets. Now we complement the presentation with some observations from the perspective from SBI and SBSTTA. So I'll give the floor to Ms. Sarpes, Chair of SBI. Charlotta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I think I can be very brief since the co-chairs already have in their presentation make linkages to a work that will be done by SBI. As mentioned already, at its third meeting, the subsidiary body for implementation will discuss 7 agenda items that relates to the post-2020 process. And it is my hope that the outcome from SBI will contribute to development in a good way. I would just like to mention that we will have agenda items on resource mobilization, capacity building, mainstreaming, report and assessment and review, among others. But it is my sincere hope that the deliberations and the outcome will, in a good way, contribute to the development of the post-global biodiversity framework. Thank you, Chair. I will now hand over to my SBSTTA colleague. Ezekiel, if you are, I would like to.
Sorry, thank you so much. Technology, right? SBSTTA 24 will discuss several elements contributing directly to the development of framework and related to the post-2020 process, in particular the monitoring framework, which will allow to track progress towards 2050 vision through assessment of delivery on 2030 targets. In particular, this monitoring framework will include elements like components of all goals and targets, specific monitoring elements to allow to assess progress towards all components, a system of indicators, the approach to baselines. As you are aware, we received during the peer review phase of the draft monitoring framework document almost 10,000 individual comments through over 340 submissions. It is amazing to see this level of engagement and interest, and I would like to thank all parties and governments and observers who contribute to the process. So we're working on this as part of the scientific and technical analysis to provide advice on numerical elements of goals and targets, to equip open-ended working groups and co-chairs with the necessary information for debates at the third meeting of the working group. In addition to other agenda items, we'll have elements in topics like health, synthetic biology, soils, EPSs, and invasive species. The role of SBSTTA is to ensure that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is based on the best available science and as well as another knowledge, and to support the approach which will allow for a transformative change. Thank you very much. And we will now like to open the floor for interventions, including questions to co-chairs. We will first take regional interventions, followed by representatives of major groups, and then, time permitting, representatives of other parties before we hand the floor back to co-chairs to respond and make any final remarks. Before I open floor for questions, I would like to invite Secretariat to give us some information on how to raise hands and to speak, and the overall use in the platform, including on accessing raise your hand, giving the floor. Please, Secretariat, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. If you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. It will turn yellow and your status will show hand raised. Please do not press twice on this button. We will be notified of your request in our queue system. The chair will invite you to speak when it is your turn. You will see on your status bar microphone open, and your speak button will flash in blue. Press the speak button, it will turn red to live, which will turn on your camera and your microphone automatically. Wait for 2 seconds, then proceed with your intervention. You may wish to ask the chair if you can be heard easily. When you are finished, please press the speak button again to turn off your live broadcast. Also, please note, unless you raise your hand, the mic cannot be given to you. So when the chair calls your country, please raise your hand in order for your mic to be on. Please speak slowly so that the interpreters are easily able to follow your statement. We would also like to remind parties that are making regional statements to forward these statements to statements@cbd.int. We would also like to remind participants that the chat box is for brief communications and therefore to keep your remarks short in the chat box. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Secretariat. Now I will hand the floor to SBI Chair. Ms. Charlotta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would now like to open the floor for questions and statements from regional statements. And I will start to give the floor to South Africa for the African region, followed by EU and its member states. South Africa, if you can raise your flag. South Africa, you have the floor. Okay, we can wait for South Africa and we can continue with the EU and its member state and then come back to South Africa. So if EU, if you can raise your flag. EU and its member state, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished Executive Secretary, distinguished Subsidiary and SBI Chair, distinguished co-chairs, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to address this virtual meeting on behalf of the European Union and its member states. First of all, we would like to express our deepest compassion with the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and social consequences. It is a challenging time for everyone, but we are aware of the particularly harsh impacts on the vulnerable. We appreciate each effort to advance the negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We therefore thank the Secretariat, the co-chairs, and the Subsidiary and SBI chairs for organizing this meeting and preparing the updated Zero draft and related Subsidiary and SBI documents. Mr. Chair, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework must bring the transformative change needed to turn our joint 2050 vision into reality. 2030 will be a crucial milestone for this. Everyone needs to step up actions without delay and rally behind the framework. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the framework must also contribute to reducing the risk of disease transmissions and pandemics. It also needs to support a nature-positive economic and social recovery. We consider the updated Zero draft an important step forward. We particularly welcome that it addresses the three objectives of the Convention as well as the Cartagena and the Nagoya protocols. The ambition of the new Global Biodiversity Framework should be equal or higher than the IG targets of the current strategic plan. We are therefore concerned to see that various updated targets are less ambitious than the original, for example, Target 1. We called for smart targets as feasible, and Subsidiary will be very important to support this. Many issues crucial to achieve the goals and targets are now reflected in the monitoring elements. They need to become a full part of the framework. We also note with concern that the conservation of marine and urban biodiversity and genetic diversity are still not adequately represented. We recognize the efforts done in addressing access and benefit sharing, but further work on the related goal, target, and indicator is still needed. Ambition needs to go hand in hand with strong implementation. We welcome the new language in the updated draft on means of implementation and strengthens mechanisms for planning, monitoring, and review, including a ratchet-up mechanism. We fully agree that the NB-subs are the main instrument for implementation. We also fully support the broad approach on resource mobilization, including the reduction of resources needed, the generation of additional resources, and its effective and efficient use. However, these parts of the framework need to be further elaborated. We can only achieve the transformative change we need through participation and partnerships with other stakeholders. We therefore welcome all efforts made for the full and effective participation, in particular of indigenous people and local communities, civil society, women and youth, as well as academia and business. The EU and its member states believe that we need a whole of society approach with a strong engagement of all actors and sectors to reach the 2050 vision. Biodiversity mainstreaming should therefore be integrated explicitly throughout the framework, including its goals and targets and our future approach. We welcome that the goals and targets are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. A strong global biodiversity framework is essential for achieving the 2030 agenda. The EU and its member states want to stress the importance of strengthened linkages between the global biodiversity framework and other relevant multilateral environmental agreements. Cooperation and synergies between the CBD and the Rio Conventions, the FAO and other international organizations will be crucial for implementing the framework. So they should remain closely involved in the preparatory process. Let me assure you that the European Union and its member states stand ready and committed to working hard with you and all your colleagues to develop and implement an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Germany, speaking on behalf of EU and its member states. I now would like to give the floor to South Africa, speaking on behalf of the African Group, followed by Antigua and Barbuda for GRULAC. South Africa, if you can raise your hand, you have the floor. Is South Africa online?
Yes. Yes.
Please, go ahead, South Africa. Okay, I understand that might be a technical glitch. We'll come back. Then I would like to continue my list. If Antigua and Barbuda, if you are ready to speak on behalf of the GRULAC region. And I would like to give the floor to Antigua and Barbuda. You have the floor. If Antigua and Barbuda can raise their... Okay, here you are. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. This intervention is made on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. We thank you sincerely, the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, for their continuous effort to update this living document. There has never been a time of more need for a multilateral response to halt biodiversity loss. And this is our opportunity to address the three objectives of the Convention in a balanced manner. We underline that sustainable use and benefit sharing of genetic resources must have an equally important role in this framework, and that there also are a number of challenges that we must consider for achieving our 2050 vision, including the need to support the development of capacities, financial, human, institutional, and technical resources at the national and global level. GRULAC wishes to express that we continue to be strongly committed with the development of the post-2020 framework. The region remains ready to continue building a transparent, fair, and equitable environment for participation in the following stages of the process. In this sense, there are some key messages that we would like to reiterate. Dear co-chairs, this framework is an ambitious initiative that will only be achieved if the opinions of all parties are carefully and effectively reflected. Thus, an equal representation of the views and perspectives of all regions must be ensured. The post-2020 framework should also be streamlined as appropriate, so it can fully embraced by all relevant stakeholders, including IPLCs, women, youth and children, subnational governments, the private sector, and citizens. For GRULAC, it is particularly important to consider the intergenerational equity, One Health, and a gender approach in this process, and that the vision of Indigenous peoples and local communities is also incorporated. There's also a need to deepen and systematize the work that is being developed for mainstreaming biodiversity in the planning and management of productive sectors, and to increase efforts for intersectoral coordination as indicated in Article 6 of the Convention. It is essential to strengthen strategic communication, education, and awareness on biodiversity at the local, national, regional, and global levels as tools to foster transformation to live in harmony with nature. We would like to remind all participants that there's no such thing as half ambition. There is need for a strong global framework to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity, along with a real commitment to provide and mobilize resources to implement the framework, considering the principles of the Rio Declaration and Article 20. Resource mobilization must be an integral part of the framework, with resources from developed countries and other donors to meet the incremental cost of national implementation in developing countries. These elements are an intrinsic part of the framework and such cannot be confined to separate COP decisions. Finally, GRULAC recognizes the relevance of the monitoring framework. However, the proposal presented for peer review is not realistic. Parties will not have the capacity to implement the whole set of indicators, and there will be need for a capacity building plan to support the knowledge and technology needed to implement these indicators. It is also important that the monitoring, implementation, and review mechanism remain flexible to include national indicators to reflect the particular realities of each country. Therefore, we recommend a focus on a methodology to choose headline indicators. Dear friends, when we said goodbye in Rome, we told you we expected to see you soon in Colombia for the third open-ended working group. It might be later than we all expected, but we hope to see you all soon in Cali. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Antigua and Barbuda, speaking on behalf of GRULAC. I will now see if South Africa, if you have raised your flag hand. Is South Africa online yet?
Can you ask Uganda to take the...
Okay. Maybe I can ask somebody else in the African region. Uganda, could you take the statement from the African region?
Hello, am I now on?
Yes, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Uganda, taking the floor on behalf of South Africa for some, they have had some difficulty connecting. So I'll read the statement for South Africa on behalf of the African group. The African group has reviewed and considered the updated zero draft and would like to commend the co-chairs and the Secretariat of the CBD on the progress made to date, which to some extent has taken into account elements of the discussion at the second open-ended working group. Having noted the GBO5, which complemented the outcomes of IPBES Global Biodiversity Assessment on Ecosystems, Africa is of the view that the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is global in nature, and consideration should be given to developing global targets which can be disaggregated and adapted to the regional, national, and subnational scales and be actionable at those scales. In this regard, Africa notes that some of the indicators provided are still not smart and continue to provide challenges to countries during implementation. Equally, the development of indicators for those targets should consider their use and feasibility at multiple scales, and particularly in the context of any strengthened accountability mechanisms that might be considered for the implementation of the framework. It is worth noting that some of the revised goals and targets, especially those that are key to our region, have lost key elements such as the ABS, which are not fully incorporated in the revised goals and targets, and their associated indicators, which have not yet been defined. Chair, the fact that the three objectives of the CBD are mutually supportive entails that issues of ABS should be given equal priority in the formulation of goals and targets in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Cognizant of the fact that there's no other process to develop a separate implementation framework for the Nagoya Protocol on ABS, and also that parties to the CBD are still obliged to ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources, it is critical that the required reflection and focus needs to equally be made on issues of ABS. The elements of biosafety targets are still not fully considered under the goals and the associated elements for the indicators. Africa is ready to deliberate further on these goals and targets in order for the parties to agree on quantifiable goals and targets without compromising their key elements. Thirdly, Africa considers this post-2020 global biodiversity framework process as an ideal platform for parties to agree on innovative solutions to ensure fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived from open access to digital sequence information for commercialization, in addition to the globally recognized non-monetary benefits, which need to be increased and made available through enhanced capacity building and technology transfer. As I come towards the end, sustainable use as a concept is not meant to prevent use, but to ensure that the livelihoods of the poor and vulnerable, who are more dependent on the use of biological resources and ecosystem services, can be safeguarded through the sustainable use of those natural resources. There is a need to present the targets and indicators in a way that recognizes that use cannot be eliminated, but it can be managed sustainably. Furthermore, there is need to recognize sustainable use and its indirect drivers, like poverty and population, which lead to overexploitation. Linkages to SDGs on these issues is very important, and this should be exploited further and included in Target 8. Target 8 on itself has focused on sustainable management, but it should also focus on sustainable use, as management is but a process of ensuring that people can benefit from the actual use. On the benefits, one of the benefits that should be included in Target 8 is poverty alleviation, which links to SDG 1. Most poor and vulnerable groups depend on biodiversity and ecosystem services as a way of alleviating poverty. Sustainable customary use has also not been covered and could be added, as it is a useful component in Africa's traditional societies that brings about conservation results. Protected area systems are vital as refugia for wildlife to Africa and climate mitigation issues, as well as tourism and employment. And therefore, to enhance the integrity of protected areas, it is very much appreciated that we talk about these protected areas. The issues of wildlife corridors need to be addressed to ensure connectivity of protected areas. And protected areas should help to address poverty issues for communities adjacent to these areas. And Africa supports the inclusion of other effective area-based conservation measures to complement protected areas and to help to address the post-2020 conservation targets. Restoration is very important for Africa, but spatial planning is also crucial for effective restoration activities. Chair, we have noted in the framing of some of the targets that the framework tends to introduce new concepts that may risk the negotiation process of the framework. While the issue of baselines has not yet been sustainably discussed in the context of the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, various options and considerations have been expressed. Therefore, there are certain targets, such as the one that supports restoration efforts, benefit sharing, and sustainable use, that will require us to carefully consider these baselines. Africa welcomes the inclusion of the means of implementation as one of the goals of the GBF, which will ensure availability of commensurate resources aligned with the level of ambition in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Therefore, consideration of resource mobilization targets and its monitoring elements should take into account the conclusions of the first report of the panel of experts, which reviewed and evaluated the strategy for resource mobilization for 2011 and 2020, and concluded that the effectiveness of the strategy for resource mobilization was limited, and that the resource mobilization component of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will need to be more efficient and effective to bridge the current gap between resource needs and resources available. Therefore, building on the strategy for resource mobilization for the Aichi targets, we need to develop target-based strategy for resource mobilization, taking into account the roles and responsibilities included in Article 20 of the CBD. The strategy should set targets for international flows, domestic financing, and private sector contribution as line items in their business plans, ensuring net gain outcomes, and recommend policy responses by parties, which is needed to achieve the resource mobilization targets. Chair, the African Group remains committed to the negotiation process of the framework when we come to the open-ended working group 3. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Uganda. Speaking on behalf of the African Group. And now we'd like to continue with the regional groups. First, I would like to give the floor to New Zealand for Jaskans, followed by Georgia for CEE. So, New Zealand, if you can raise your hand. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Chair, this statement is made on behalf of Australia, Canada, Iceland, Monaco, New Zealand, Norway, and Switzerland. And greetings on this Saturday morning. Firstly, thank you to our co-chairs of the Post-2020 process for their presentation and especially for their hard work in producing an updated draft. Thank you also to the chairs of SBI and to Subsidiary and to the Secretariat, of course. At the beginning of the week, with the launch of the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, we heard the stark reality of the task ahead of the global community. Now, at the end of the week, we are meeting to discuss our course for the next decade and beyond. It is a course we embarked on some time ago, started formally at COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh, but in reality long before that, when it was clear that the Aichi targets were not going to be met. We have collectively agreed that we need ambition and transformation. The task before us is to define that ambition. But in the midst of this already challenging task, we've been thrown an additional challenge, COVID-19. Now, when the global biodiversity community should ideally be locked in a room until we have produced a plan to bend the curve, we can't do that. We acknowledge the extensive work so far undertaken by the Secretariat, our co-chairs, parties, international organisations, Indigenous peoples and local communities, and civil society on the draft Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, whether in the form of written submissions, participation in thematic consultations, or in meetings of the open-ended working group. But we're sure we would all agree we are nowhere near where we should be in the process due to COVID-19. We fully appreciate the efforts made by all involved, not least our co-chairs, the Secretariat, the current and future presidencies and other parties to manage this continuously moving timetable. We particularly welcome the virtual sessions that have been organised for this week as part of the subsidiary body meetings. While there have been teething problems, this has been an excellent opportunity to test processes and demonstrate progress. In our view, we need to explore ways to make progress before the next and final meeting of the open-ended working group. We have additional time, and we should be using this to advance our work. Accordingly, we would support proposals for additional virtual discussions and exchanges, provided they are inclusive and they drive progress. To complement the good work underway via the formal process, we in Just Cans encourage our fellow parties to join us in looking for more options for informal, party-led small group discussions on key post-2020 issues. Chair, these are testing times for multilateral processes, but it is up to us to demonstrate that we are up for the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand, speaking on behalf of Jaskans. I would now like to give the floor to Georgia, speaking on behalf of CEE region. Georgia, if you, yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the Central and Eastern European region, I would like to thank the co-chairs of the process for the excellent work undertaken and the updated zero draft of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. We would also like to thank the Secretariat and SBI chairs for organizing these virtual sessions, which is a good opportunity to keep the process ongoing. We consider enhanced communication and cooperation at this stage as important prerequisite for development of effective and successful framework. Numerous reports highlight unprecedented loss of biodiversity, and on Tuesday we were presented the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, showing that we have collectively failed to achieve the 2020 targets. Despite the findings of the GBO5, we would like to recall the national efforts made to achieve national goals in line with the Global Strategic Plan. However, it is clear that our efforts were not sufficient to address current unprecedented challenges, and this is an important alert for stronger and urgent joint action is needed to address the extinction crisis. Also, we would like to emphasize important efforts at the sub-regional level for implementation of the CBD commitments through the new model of cooperation within the Regional Biodiversity Task Force of the Southeast Europe as part of the CE region for strategic planning of the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. In terms of implementation, once again, we would like to highlight that capacity building and resource mobilization is key to ensure implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and achievement of the post-2020 goals. Therefore, we were delighted yesterday to hear about the work of the Resource Mobilization Panel. We would like to stress the importance of increased funding for biodiversity from all sources. At the same time, efficient use of existing resources and effective measures to avoid future expenditures are crucial. In addition, we acknowledge that the preparation of the Green Agenda for the West Balkans as a part of the CE within the Green Deal of the European Union represents a unique opportunity for the developing a robust investment plan for the region, centered on the creation of inclusive instruments for cooperation on biodiversity, clean energy, and green economic recovery. It is clear that the monitoring framework is a major step towards green progress in the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of biodiversity. However, we also acknowledge that some countries may not be able to monitor new goals quickly and efficiently. Therefore, in addition to the full list of indicators, it could be necessary to define also how such countries will report on their progress towards the new objectives. For the GBF to be successful, we will need a much stronger implementation, monitoring, and review process, but we also must ensure that all parties will be able to follow it. Finally, considering that the post-2020 framework is supposed to become overarching framework, we consider that involvement of other biodiversity-related and other MEAs should be considerably increased, and we would be pleased to hear what are the plans in this regard. We are looking forward to the in-depth discussions during the upcoming SBSTTA SBI sessions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Georgia, on behalf of CEE region. We I will now open the floor for some parties before I continue with the major groups. And I would like to start with Bhutan, if you can raise your flag. And then I would like to go on to Brazil. Bhutan, you have the floor. If Bhutan can you raise your flag? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you to the co-chairs for the updated draft. We understand that the goal and the targets of having to increase X% of area or species or ecosystems, but there are also countries that have already made ambitious commitments and face challenges in maintaining what they have already committed. For example, a small country like Bhutan, we have more than 50% of our total area as protected and committed in our constitution to maintain 60% of forest cover at all times. So how do these goals and targets apply to countries with already high ambitions when we know that maintaining the current commitment also requires a lot of resources and capacity? The goals and targets in the GBF should also find ways to accommodate countries with already high ambitions and support them to maintain what they have. Secondly, the least developed and the developing countries should be given additional assistance in understanding and maneuvering through the GBF for more efficient and equitable negotiation of the agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Bhutan. I would now like to give the floor to Brazil. Brazil, if you raise your hand. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear delegates, Brazil would like to express its appreciation and thanks for the efforts of the Secretariat to convene this meeting in these exceptional times. We believe we must build on this momentum to continue with informal discussions on the major priorities of the GBF, with a special emphasis on resource mobilization. Firstly, as the pandemic has widened the already huge discrepancies in financial capabilities between developed and developing countries, we believe that transformative change will only take place with countries working... I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, we believe that transformative change will only take place with countries working collectively, based on the common but differentiated responsibilities. This implies not only adequate resource provision to developing countries, but also the definition of a fair baseline. In this regard, we appreciate Spain's and Portugal's decision to recognize the importance of CDBR in our last Ibero-American summit in order to achieve the SDGs. Secondly, as the expert report on resource mobilization demonstrated, the private sector needs to step up their contributions, although the main predictable source of resource mobilization remains the contributions of developed countries. We must create innovative financial mechanisms to support local communities, such as through the payment for ecosystem services. This mechanism, which has already been recognized by CDB decisions, can be a cost-effective solution to meet our challenges, and it has the advantage of supporting local communities. Thirdly, resource mobilization should not give prominence to conservation and restoration projects at the expense of the other two pillars of the CDB. All the three objectives of the Convention have to be clearly reflected in a new framework and receive financial resources in a balanced way. To achieve long-lasting solutions to halt biodiversity loss, we should raise the importance in the post-2020 agenda of sustainable use, and particularly of benefit-sharing arrangements with countries of origin of genetic resources. Parallel to resource mobilization, we will need to identify an appropriate set of indicators to achieve measurability. As national reporting often proves burdensome to many developing countries, it is also essential to identify those indicators that are already easily available to all member states. So we look forward to our future discussions, and thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Brazil. I would now like to give the floor to Iran, followed by UK, and then unfortunately I had to close the list of parties so we can continue to major groups. But first I would like to give the floor to Iran. If you can raise your hand. Is Iran connected?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead. Iran? Yes. Now I can see you but not hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, I will continue then.
Yes, please.
Sorry for the technical problem. I would like to appreciate and thank the President, the chairpersons, the co-chairs, and the working group and the Secretariat for preparation of excellent updated zero draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Ladies and gentlemen, Convention on Biological Diversity is a covenant among 192 nations, acknowledging the role of technology, including biotechnology, for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. CBD calls the contracting parties in its Article 16 to provide and/or facilitate access for and transfer of relevant technologies to developing countries. Access to biological diversity has been granted by the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on ABS, and yet the benefit sharing is somehow blurred. But so far, there is no protocol to ensure the smooth and proper access of developing countries to technologies. The current capacity building programs under the CBD mainly focus on the regulation of technologies and not on the creation, development, access, and use of the relevant technologies. The Target 16 of the updated draft at its current form is not in accordance with Article 16 of the CBD text itself. We wish to officially request the proper attention to the contributions and statements mentioned by parties, as is well reflected in pages 40 to 42 of the report of the meeting WG 2020/REC/2/1. Ladies and gentlemen, environmental issues do not recognize man-made political borders. As an example, every year, Anzali Lake hosts hundreds of thousands of migratory birds of some 80 species flying across several countries, neither recognizing nor respecting the country borders. COVID-19 is another example. It is not the first and will not be the last disease to claim nearly millions of lives. Though no evidence is available to support that SARS-CoV-2 was not born from the wild, but it is most likely that the prevention of such disaster lies in the respect to the wild, and the cure for the disease may also be found in nature. This may not be achieved without full commitment and collaboration of all countries. Any failure in one country will have definite and immediate impact on the biodiversity and public health at regional and global scale. To this end, therefore, I would like to mention that the sanctions Iran is suffering from these days are not only targeting Iranian nations, but also the whole world. These sanctions have sharply affected national plans to conserve biodiversity and to halt the degradation of ecosystems, such as afforestation and initiatives related to mountains and saving endangered species. All related activities, including scientific and technical exchanges, including receiving financial support from GEF, are seriously affected. Iran is prepared to share its wealth of germplasm with the world, extend hand and embrace any collaboration to achieve such a goal. We are prepared to contribute to the improvement of the Target 16 of the current updated draft to accommodate the concerns raised by some countries, including Islamic Republic of Iran, about the
Yes, excuse me, Iran, if you can wrap up because we have a bit short of time.
I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Iran, for your statement. And finally, UK, before I hand over to my Substa colleague. UK, you have the floor. UK, if you can raise your hand. Yes, now I see you. You have the floor.
Can you hear me?
And I can hear you.
Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. The UK would like to thank the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, the SBSTTA and SBI chairs, the Secretariat and the Bureau for their work. We don't underestimate the challenge you face, and indeed all of us face, in maintaining the momentum to develop an ambitious and transformational post-2020 global biodiversity framework, despite the difficulties and uncertainty created by the current pandemic. We look forward to renewed impetus arising from this year's UNGA and its associated Biodiversity Summit. The fifth Global Biodiversity Outlook is a frank and sobering assessment. We have not fully achieved any of the Aichi targets, but it's not too late. We must act decisively now to bend the curve, to put nature on a path to recovery and deliver the required transformational changes. The updated Zero Draft is a good basis to realize our joint ambition. It provides greater clarity on the structure of goals and targets. We must now build on this by addressing the overlaps between some of the goals, milestones, and targets, by giving greater prominence to the ocean, by ensuring that targets are ambitious, evidence-based, and measurable, but also clear and easily communicated to drive actions by all sectors of society. However, agreeing ambitious goals and targets is not sufficient. They should be underpinned by a transparent monitoring, reporting, and review mechanism that strengthens accountability, drives ambition, and ensures implementation. They should also be underpinned by the provision of resource mobilization from all sources that is commensurate to the scale of the problem. The UK is concerned that significant work is still required on these and other critical issues, which are all closely interlinked. We encourage everyone to consider creative ways in which progress can be made to develop common ground and concrete proposals on these issues. We must have a complete package ready by COP15 to avoid further delays in implementation. We also see a very strong convergence and interdependence between the policy agendas on biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. As co-hosts of UNFCCC COP26, we are committed to putting nature at the heart of our approach to tackling climate change. We look forward to working with all parties and stakeholders to agree an ambitious framework that spurs actions and transformative changes needed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, UK. Thank you all for very interesting interventions. I would now like to hand the floor to my Substa colleague, Mr. Benitez Diaz.
Thank you very much to all. I will now like to open the floor for interventions by representatives of major stakeholder groups. Each statement should not exceed 3 minutes, please. We have 20 minutes to have like 8 interventions, 6 from major groups, then co-chairs, then COP presidency for next COP. So I count with your cooperation. First, I will give the floor to the representative of indigenous peoples and local communities, Xochitl Rodrigo de la Cruz. Please raise your hand. Tiene la palabra Rodrigo de la Cruz, por favor.
You have the floor, Rodrigo de la Cruz, for 3 minutes. please take the floor. Presidents, parties and intergovernmental parties, and brothers and sisters of the IPLCs, on behalf of the IIFP, wish to express our thanks for giving this participatory space for Indigenous peoples and as key players in the construction of the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The IIFB reiterates its global commitment to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity as a guarantee for life on our planet. Biological and cultural diversity, it's a strategic alliance between nature, culture and Indigenous peoples, and it should be a cross-cutting axis within the action to be taken in the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this will be better stimulus for IPLCs. We, after the ones, are the ones that conserve a great quantity of terrestrial biodiversity in our lands, territories and waters, and these are conserved and maintained by our customary laws on the use and management of biological resources which meet our ways of living and needs in a sustainable way in balance between ourselves and nature. Cheers, as we've already commented, conservation and traditional knowledge are goals that have been identified in the key messages in the IPBES Global Assessment Report, which points out that a large part of wild and domesticated species in the world still survive in areas that are traditionally managed, owned, used or occupied by IPLCs. This is because we possess the Indigenous and local knowledge, and our societies possess the resource management governance structures based on our traditional knowledge. Thus, these customary practices should be affirmed, revitalized and supported so that this knowledge can be passed down from one generation to another for the benefit of biodiversity. Establishing strategic alliances between IPLCs and parties is fundamental for the full recognition of customary sustainable use of biodiversity, which is why we very much appreciate the fact that the Zero Draft recognises the participation of IPLCs as a condition for facilitating the implementation of the post-2020 framework. This should be strongly reflected, we recommend, in its goals, targets and indicators that will allow us to reach the 2050 vision, such as living in harmony with nature. Thus, we commit to working with you in order to achieve this within the modalities that have been adopted to address our concerns and fundamental rights. The 2030 mission and the goals for 2030 and 2050 should reflect and recognise the joint development of biocultural diversity and its inextricable linkages as indicated in the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration. And so I'm going to talk about certain specific aspects: the cross-cutting Indigenous peoples, culture and nature approach for strengthening biodiversity, and also our role in the Gender Action Plan. Then there's the legal recognition of Indigenous territories and customary land tenure as a differentiated category in terms of land use. We also need to improve and increase the connectivity of biocultural sites on land and seascapes and strengthen the customary use of biological resources in relation with cultural traditional practices compatible with biodiversity, and also in relation to the invasive alien species that are harming our territories. And finally, Chairman, we urge that the proposals that have been presented by the IIFB should be taken into account as our contribution within the new post-2020 framework. Thank you very much. And the interpreter points out that I've read that statement because it was very bad sound. So I'd like to remind you, says the chair, that we only have 3 minutes each. I'm now going to give the floor to GBYN. 3 minutes, please.
Have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should lead to the system-wide transformative change that we need in all sectors of our society to tackle the biodiversity crisis and finally live in harmony within nature. This is a very ambitious vision, and to achieve it, we need fundamental shifts in our systems of values and behaviors. If the goals and targets do not address the underlying issues of biodiversity loss, we will see a repeat of the failures of the Aichi targets in 2030. In the face of a worsening pandemic, the move to shift CBD meetings online makes sense, but it should be taken into account that digital participation is exclusionary. The development of the framework is supposed to take an inclusive and participatory approach. The majority of rural, indigenous, and youth communities that lack access to the internet or the means to connect online will be excluded. Regarding the framework itself, these are some of the youth priorities that we would like to highlight and are not yet reflected in the framework to the extent that is necessary. First, a transformative education is crucial for achieving the 2050 vision. Transformative education deserves a standalone target, and we support the text that was proposed in the OWEB 2 for a target on transformative education on biological and cultural diversity, languages, sustainability, and heritage. If there is no such a standalone target, we would like to propose a better integration of transformative education in Target 19. Secondly, while human rights are crucial and should be reflected in a number of targets, they are siloed in Target 20. And here they are subject to national circumstances. There was a specific proposal in OWEG 2 and to add a new target in the framework focused on supporting and protecting those individuals and groups who are at the forefront of defending biodiversity and human rights and who are often at risk as a result. We strongly support this proposal. The importance of ecosystem services and biodiversity for the full enjoyment of human rights cannot be overemphasized. Biodiversity around the world is being destroyed at an unprecedented rate with grave and far-reaching implications for human well-being. A global biodiversity framework that is premised on human rights perspective will help to heighten the urgent need to protect biodiversity and promote policy coherence. Finally, intergenerational equity is a fundamental principle for all our society. We must pursue justice between generations and within generations. We're happy to see that the updated draft of the Post-2020 has included this principle as an enabling condition, but we also emphasize that it needs to be reflected in the goals and targets. The same goes for other crucial principles.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we need to keep the time. Still many interventions. I'm so sorry. I look for your cooperation. I would now like to hand the floor to a representative of Women Caucus, Minranili Rai, please, from FARN. You have the floor.
Chairs, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Proceed, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Rinalini, and I'm speaking on behalf of the CB Women's Caucus. 2020 is an important year for biodiversity, for nature, for women and indigenous peoples, the custodians. This year marks the 70 years of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, 10 years of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We would like to add our voices to those who are concerned about the process of the updated zero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, especially as we note with concern that many of our comments and the comments of many parties in support of full gender mainstreaming throughout the post-2020 GBF made during the open-ended working group has not been adequately addressed, including the suggestion for a standalone target on gender besides Target 20, which seems weakened in the updated draft. The rights, roles, and contributions of women, as well as those of IPLCs and youth, have not been integrated at the level and with the ambition required of this framework to reverse biodiversity loss and ensure that both people and nature can thrive. It is clear that the rights-based approach mentioned in the theory of change has yet to be integrated. The GBO5 clearly showed the systemic failure of the Archer targets and how conventional exclusionary conservation approaches have not been able to halt biodiversity loss. To avoid this from happening again, the framework should include strong measures and mechanisms to enforce inclusive and equitable biodiversity governance at the local, subnational, national, regional, and global levels, and increase the reporting and accountability of parties. Inclusive governance implies gender responsive, equitable, intergenerational, intercultural, the full and effective and meaningful participation of IPLCs, women, and other diverse, marginalized, and vulnerable groups in decision-making of planning, implementation, reporting, and evaluation of the GBF. It should also be ensured that GBF redirects all perverse incentives and other investments away from projects and sectors that harm biodiversity and towards gender-responsive IPLC governance and biodiversity to address the critical transitions as has been reflected in LBO2 for the systemic and cultural change needed to support the ultimate aim of living in harmony with nature. We encourage parties to reflect and respond to the report of the thematic workshop on human rights and enabling conditions in the post-2020 GBF framework, informing the next version of the GBF draft 1.0 to be discussing during open-ended working group 3. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, youth representative. Now I'll give the floor to representative of subnational and local governments, Roger Gabriel Rivero Barrera, Regions for Sustainable Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Please proceed.
Okay, I will switch now to Spanish because we know our statement. Thank you very much. Honorables presidentes, copresidentes.
Co-chairs, distinguished delegates, I'm taking the floor on behalf of the sub-national governments dealing with biodiversity, coordinated together with Quebec, and also on behalf of CLI, which is dealing with the Aichi biodiversity targets. And we'd like to thank the Secretariat for having continuously seeking to adapt the important conversations we're having these days to the world's challenging situation. A global pandemic is yet another urgent call to action. And we also encourage you to take account of what we have done in the subnational and local governments. We have participated in the Edinburgh process for subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Led by the Scottish Government, this process has engaged subnational and local governments from all over the world that are deeply concerned about the impacts of the loss of biodiversity and climate change on our livelihoods and communities. Joining our voices with like-minded delegates and decision makers in the Edinburgh Declaration, this has been very enlightening because it has allowed us to see the impact of the decade-long plan of action on subnational governments under Decision 1022. We strongly support the call for action included in this declaration and recall that we stand ready to meet the challenges that we face today to deliver the post-2020 GBF on biodiversity and to overcome the devastating consequences of the global pandemic. Specifically, we call on parties to adopt a new dedicated decision at COP15, which builds upon and renews Decision 1022. And significantly raises ambition for subnational and local actions towards implementing the post-2020 framework. We recognise that our organisations need to fulfil a collective potential, and we therefore invite you to reach out to subnational and regional governments and invite them to join us in our efforts. The only way to reach this vision of living in harmony with nature is to work side by side to achieve the transformative actions that are so needed. And we remain committed to engaging with you on these points and further points. And thank you very much. May we continue the good work together.
The working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework invites the UN Environment Management Group to convene a UN system-wide process to contribute to preparation and implementation on post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I would like to give the floor to a representative of the United Nations Environment Management Group for a 3-minute statement. Satya Tripathi, Director of EMG Secretariat, please raise your hand. You have the floor. If they are not ready yet, I'll give the floor to representative of NGOs, non-government organizations, Gadir Lavadens from CBD Alliance. CBD Alliance, you have the floor for a 3-minute statement, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. Okay, sorry. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We first would like to express our solidarity to all those suffering from the pandemic and a global call for action to stop ecocide happening right now in the world, thanks to the fires caused in most around the globe, in most cases, if not all, by policies implemented by governments that go against biodiversity. Then, we're still concerned on why SBSTTA is not allowed to provide advice on goals and targets when this was the mandate. We understand there might not be a negotiation of language, but cannot understand why there will not be even space for scientific, technical, and technological advice. The general feeling of members of the CBD Alliance is that the new draft is still not strong enough to deal with the great challenges we have ahead of us, and does not address the root causes of biodiversity loss. While a lot of attention is put on targets and goals, if they remain on a voluntary sort of basis, not much change will occur in the future. Also, more attention should be paid to enabling conditions and ensuring a robust compliance mechanism to ensuring implementation. It was mentioned that a strong emphasis should be given to IPLCs, and it is also mentioned in the recent IPBES report. However, the language referring to IPLCs in the new draft is significantly weaker than the original draft and even non-compliant to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UN REAP. On resource mobilizations, we feel it makes little sense to ask for increased investments in biodiversity conservation if governments continue to invest far more funding in subsidies for fiscal incentives and infrastructure and other projects that harm biodiversity. Then divesting from biodiversity harm and redirecting perverse incentives should be absolute priorities of parties to the CBD. Then the concept of nature-based solutions remains uncharted in the CBD context and could undermine the long-established ecosystem approach of the CBD. The hyper over nature-based solutions might be used by fossil fuel emitters to offset their emissions and to continue emitting instead of addressing the root causes of biodiversity loss. Finally, we consider that the One Welfare approach should be included in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which addresses the linkages between humans, animals, and nature in a way that extends beyond addressing only health. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Muchísimas gracias por su presentación.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And now the UN Environment Management Group representative, you have the floor. 3 minutes.
Representative of United Nations Environment Management Group, Satya. Go ahead.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you. I hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. Following the request of the open-ended working group, WG 2020, on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to facilitate the contribution of the UN system to the development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the 25th UN Environment Management Group Senior Officials meeting in September 2019 established an interagency consultative process composed of 51 agencies to facilitate such a contribution from the UN system. Building on that, the consultative process prepared 2 contributions to support the development of the framework and submitted them to the CBD's Working Group 2020 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In parallel with that, the consultative process embarked on the preparation of a UN-wide report describing the UN system's approach both to engage in and support member states in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including a UN system high-level commitment to engage in its implementation. The report is now at the final stages of endorsement by the Secretary General and will be available for the General Assembly session next week, later in September. The report provides information from 51 EMG members on the relevance of biodiversity to their existing mandates, as well as to their current activities and programs. It addresses key roles that the members of the EMG could play to support UN member states, as well as how their activities can help address the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss within their mandates and in alignment with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It also contains a high-level statements by heads of agencies of the 51 UN entities committing to support member states in implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Concerned by the negative trends in the status of biodiversity and based on the clear evidence of the need to transform our relationship with nature, the UN agencies have agreed on 4 main areas of action to support member states during 2030, including 1, support country abilities to halt biodiversity loss and to sustainably use and enhance biodiversity through policies and programs, establish strong coalitions for biodiversity. 3rd, mainstream biodiversity in UN internal programs and operations. And lastly, enhance UN-wide coherence and follow-up on biodiversity. For further information on the EMG upcoming report and the next steps of its process on biodiversity, please refer to the EMG website, www.ung.org. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Now I would like to turn to the co-chairs to make any closing remarks, very short, still some more interventions. So I'll give the floor to Basil. Basil, you have the floor. Microphone to Basil, please.
Okay, just a very short intervention. There is clearly a lot of interest, and I want to thank you, every one of you, for your intervention. One key message from me, from Francis and I, is that there is a need for more space for dialogue. We will be working with the Bureau and the Presidency to accommodate that. There is the idea of a coming stakeholder forum, and we're really looking forward. We've taken pages and pages of note. I'm not able to go through every one of those, but I just want to thank you again for all your input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basil. Go ahead, Francis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just like my co-chair said, we thank our delegates for this very useful feedback on the updated zero draft. We really continue to appreciate the time that they have allocated to this process. We're developing a framework that is going to last for 30 years, so really we need to keep receiving this feedback. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continue to interact with you.
Thank you very much to both co-chairs. Distinguished delegates, we are near to the end of our meeting. We should also take a moment to look to the road ahead. Therefore, I would like now to give the floor to China, the host of the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, to make a statement. China, please raise your hand and you have the floor.
China, 请打开您现在可以发言了。中国。
with China, and unfortunately we're ending our time with the interpretation, and this is bringing us to the end of our session. I hope China can connect soon. It's quite important to have a COP15 presidency with us. Meanwhile, I would like to very quickly give the floor to my colleague Charlotte to have some remarks on behalf of SBI Chair. So, Charlotte, you have the floor.
Thank you, SBSTTA Chair, and I will just take the opportunity to thank the co-chairs of the working group for all work on the updated zero draft, and also thank them that they presented today. Thanks to all participants for your intense interventions. And I would also like to thank the co-chairs for the excellent collaboration with me on SBI agenda items related to Post-2020, and in particular for development of annex attached to the document prepared for SBI agenda item 5, the document on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you very much, and all success for the work ahead for the co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chair of SBI. Dear colleagues, as we are in a critical stage of developing the specific elements of the framework, it is important to have high-quality, constructive discussions at SBSTTA to provide solid advice to parties for the deliberations at the third meeting of the working group. So I would like to invite and urge all of you to be active members at SBSTTA 24 discussions and provide the best scientific and technical rather than political advice. A comprehensive and solid monitoring framework with the system of indicators at various levels, facilitating national reporting adopted as part of the framework will make a big difference compared to the previous period and build the basis for better implementation and reporting. Your previous and future input are instrumental for our success, and looking forward to interesting, informative, constructive, and specific discussions at SBSTTA 24. I would also like to wish both co-chairs all success in their future important work. I will try to give the floor again. I hope China can connect properly. So China, you have the floor for this last intervention, please. Seems we still have a problem. China?
请问能听见吗？
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
尊敬的杭达拉
Respected Elizabeth, respected Mr. President, OEWG Chair, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to take part in this special virtual meeting on behalf of COP Presidents. Due to the impact of COVID-19, we cannot have our meeting offline. But the post-2020 biodiversity framework consultations, this momentum has never been weakened. So here, I would like to express gratitude to Egypt, the president of COP, for the coordination, to Convention Secretariat for the arrangement, to SBSTTA, SBI, and co-chairs for their hard work, and to the active participation of all parties and shareholders. GBO 5, which was released 3 days ago, reminded us once again that what we are doing now is critical in reversing the trend of global diversity loss. The work is for the present and will benefit the future. The launch of the updated post-2020 Global Diversity Framework consultation text today provides us an opportunity to have effective and in-depth communication. China welcomes the new version and believes that important progress has been made in the framework consultation process. So China has made its effort and has protected more than 25% of our territory. And as the presidency of COP15, China firmly supports multilateralism and has always been active in participating and promoting the multilateral process of biodiversity. We look forward to working with all parties to continue to advance the three goals of the Convention on Biodiversity in a balanced manner, under the premise of adhering to the principles of fairness, transparency, and party-driven. We will encourage all parties to expand consensus, meet each other halfway, and promote a balanced, pragmatic, and effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework in order to form a more just and enabling biodiversity governance system. On September 30, the Biodiversity Summit will be held during the 75th session of the General Assembly. China will also host an online ministerial roundtable on September 24 to further build consensus among all parties, and hope each of our efforts will be a big step forward in the global biodiversity process. Finally, we would like to once again thank the international community for its trust and support for China to organize COP15. China will actively prepare for the conference and create a comfortable, safe, and hygienic conference environment. We look forward to seeing you in Kunming soon. Thank you.
To China for these words, and we look forward to see you there soon in our next conference of the parties. Colleagues, we have now reached the end of this session today and the end of a highly intense but ultimately successful week for the convention. This 4-day trial, which allows us an opportunity to test a new platform in case is needed in the future. My colleague Charlotta, the SBI chair, and I are grateful to you for your sustained interest during the last 4 days and for the effort you have made to join these meetings, despite for some very challenging time zones, including me. I believe this rich experience will provide us with a better understanding of what may be in store for us in the future. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Secretariat, the interpreters, so much to interpreters, the report writers, and the administrators of this platform. The special virtual joint session of Substa and SBI is now closed. Thank you very much.